I have no idea. I don't think I'm qualified enough, and I think it was probably just pure randomness.
One person creating all of this? How possible is that?
I suppose we'll never really know. Everyone has their own beliefs on how it came about.
I'm not even sure, to be honest.
I believe in cause and effect. So for me, I very much believe in the Big Bang, but I very much believe that there needed to be a cause for that.
To be fair, we don't really know how the Big Bang came on.
It just created, really. It's physics.
This evening, we have a speaker who is well qualified to look at the state of the world and indeed the universe. Ard Louis was born in the Netherlands. He was raised in Gabon in West Africa, received his first degree from the University of Utrecht and his PhD in theoretical physics from Cornell University. So he's very well traveled. He's now a professor of theoretical physics at Oxford University. He leads a team working on problems arising at the boundaries of chemistry, physics, and biology. One of his hobbies, I understand, is molecular gastronomy, which means applying science to the art of cooking. For anyone who's watched Breaking Bad, that didn't turn out too well, but I don't think that's what he means.
First time that a High Court judge has mentioned my name and Breaking Bad. So I'm not quite sure where we'll go from here. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I love speaking about these topics, and it's a great honor that some of you came out to listen to me. So I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa. My parents are biologists. We lived in the middle of the jungle. I grew up with a chimpanzee called Bertje. It was about the age of my sister, 1 or 2 years younger than me. My mother also said, it was interesting raising a child and a chimpanzee. Although we look different, I hope you agree, we behave remarkably similarly. When I was 7, I went to the Netherlands and for a year, and we lived in flats. And at some point, I remember looking up very distinctly and thinking, behind every single one of those windows is another family. It was a kind of existential moment when I realized I wasn't the only person in the world. And perhaps 7 is a little bit old to realize that, but that's when I did. And it was just I still remember the feeling of kind of awe and dread. And just this feeling of, wow, every single one of those windows has a family with all the things that come with that. Of course, as I went to school, I learned that not only were there families behind those windows, but there was a whole Earth. In fact, that Earth is part of a very large system of planets we call the solar system. And our solar system is just one of many, many, many such systems around stars in our Milky Way galaxy. This is a picture of the Milky Way in which we are here on the corner. You can just see that little circle. That's where we are spinning at an incredible speed around a giant, massive black hole at the center of our galaxy. And what's even more amazing is this galaxy is just one of many, many, many galaxies. So this picture from the Hubble Deep Space Telescope is not a picture of stars, but of galaxies. Every dot on there is a galaxy like our Milky Way. We think that there are on the order of 10 to the 11 galaxies, perhaps even more. There's about 10 to the 11 stars in each one, so if you multiply that, it gives you a 1 with 22 zeros. That's the number of stars. That's an unimaginably large number. It's absolutely amazing. And it could be more, right? We haven't explored the edges of the universe yet. It's absolutely spectacular. And so just like I experienced a sense of awe looking at those windows, we might all experience a sense of awe looking at the size of our universe. It's unbelievable. And there's nothing new about this. In the Psalms, in the Bible, a poet wrote, "When I look at the stars, what is man that you are mindful of him?" Throughout history, people have looked up at the stars and had this sense that there's something more. And all that our microscopes and our telescopes have done is enhanced that sense of wonder, that sense of grandeur. It's a great honor to be here in a cathedral and to speak about the the world around to speak about science, because I think science and faith connect together very well. In my own life, my faith is a big motivator for doing science. I think these things connect together, and it's wonderful to be here in this sacred space. I was also speaking about beginning. So where did our universe come from? Well, we physicists believe the universe arose from a big bang about 13.77 billion years ago, and we're pretty sure about that time. It started with something we think is called cosmic inflation, where it expanded very quickly, and then there were the dark ages for about 400 million years when there was no stars. Then the first stars appeared. Those stars grew and developed over time. Planets began to appear much, much later. Stars such as our sun arose. And at some point, we arose on this earth, and here we are. And so obviously this idea of a Big Bang is super interesting because it tells us there was a beginning. You may not know this, but the word Big Bang was coined by the great British astrophysicist Fred Hoyle. Hoyle had a competitor theory, which is a theory of a steady-state universe that had no beginning. And he later admitted that his atheism was an important motivator for this particular scientific theory. The idea of the universe having a beginning, which suggests a beginner, was something he didn't like. And so the word Big Bang was a pejorative term. It's just a Big Bang. At many pejorative terms, it stuck. And so here we are. We call this thing a Big Bang. There's lots of interesting questions you might ask, like, so where did the Big Bang come from, and how did it start, and what was before the Big Bang? All kinds of questions that physics can't really answer. It's not with current physics. The way physics works is we have theories like magnetism, electromagnetism, or various nuclear forces, or gravity, and we can combine some of them together, but not all of them yet. And the closer you get to the beginning of the universe, the more important it is to have a theory of all those different forces working together. And since we don't have that theory, we don't really know what's happening very early in the universe. We can just conjecture about it. And you may say that the question of what was before the Big Bang is maybe not a good question, because that's when time began, as far as physics is concerned. And so what is there before time is not that clear. Now, many physicists have written about this question of where the universe comes from. And we can ask a really big question. Why is there a universe in the first place? You can ask the question in many different ways. And I want to tell you one way that you should not ask the question. So a famous physicist called Lawrence Krauss wrote a book in 2012 called A Universe from Nothing. And in it, he proposed his own theory of how the universe could arise from a quantum fluctuation. So quantum mechanics is the physics of very small things, and there are some ways you can make a universe pop out of a quantum vacuum. And the back of that book had a quote from my colleague in Oxford, Richard Dawkins, who basically said, if I paraphrase, this book will be as important as The Origin of Species from Charles Darwin, because it lays to rest finally this pesky question that theologians are asking, is why is there something rather than nothing? If you like kind of mean reviews, there's a very eviscerating review in the New York Times of this book by another atheist called David Albert from Columbia University, a great philosopher of physics, who points out that the question of why is there something rather than nothing is not why is there our universe, because perhaps you couldn't make a theory that explains where the Big Bang comes from. The real deep question is, where do the laws of physics come from? Where does stuff come from in the first place? Right, that's a deep question. So if somebody tells you scientists have figured out where the Big Bang came from, ergo there is no God, then you know that's probably not the deep question. They probably don't quite understand what the question is about. In fact, interestingly, the deep question is, why are there these laws of nature? Why are there the laws of physics, for example, that allow a universe to even exist? And there are really three possible answers to that question. The first one is this. The universe, as we know it, has always existed. It's an eternal universe. That would be Fred Hoyle's eternal universe. Now, that's perfectly possible, but it's very strange, because if it's always existed, then the laws of nature have always existed, or perhaps they were caused by some previous set of laws. But where did those laws come from? Well, perhaps a previous set of laws, and you get this infinite regress of something's always causing something back forever. Now, that's possible, but it's different from anything that we've ever experienced or know about, and certainly not a scientific idea. Another possibility is that, the laws of nature popped into being out of true nothingness. I use a fancy word here called ontological nothingness for the experts in the room, but it just means nothing, nothing. So I mean no laws of mathematics, no laws of logic, no laws of science, real nothing. And suddenly, out of nothing, these laws of nature appear. It's perfectly possible, but odd on first point. A third option is that all that we see, all of the physical world, the laws of nature, is due to a transcendent being, something outside of space and time, and a being who, by his very nature, cannot not exist, something outside of space and time. And that is the God of classical theism, the unmoved mover, the first cause of Aquinas, for example. And it's really important to point out that may also seem odd to you, particularly if you're not a theist. You may think, well, how do you know about that? That's weird. That's fine. I'm just pointing out that each of these three options is a non-scientific option. Each of these three options is all by itself slightly odd. And you've got to find other evidence to kind of weave together to decide which of these three is the most likely one. But there isn't some kind of science tells us where the universe comes from. We don't need God. That doesn't make it'll never answer that question, and no advance of science ever will. You are forced to choose one of these three options and then see what that might mean for who you are. And it's also important for those of us who are Christians to remember that the God we believe in is not a being like ourselves, only smarter and stronger and wiser. God is the source of all being, the reason why the universe exists. In classical theism, God sustains the universe. If God were to stop sustaining the universe, it's not like it would slowly grind to a halt. It would simply no longer exist. That's who God is, something well beyond our understanding and our imagination, but the original cause and the reason for why this universe is here. So that's kind of a very brief introduction, because I'm here as a scientist, somebody who believes in God very deeply and profoundly, and I wanted to just kill a few zombie myths. And I call them zombie myths because even though they're clearly myths and we keep hacking at them, they kind of reappear in the public imagination again and again. And one of the kind of classic myths is that scientists don't believe in God. Well, obviously I'm a scientist, I believe in God, so there's evidence of one, but there are many scientists who believe in God. So in Oxford, in my department of physics, I know of maybe 15, 20 of my colleagues who not only believe in God, are active members of the churches, a number of them preach. In fact, one of my colleagues, Paul, is sitting in the back, manning the Christian Science bookstall. And we don't think it's strange. We find it very natural. Once a term, in fact, we meet together as scientists and Christians thinking about some topic on the border between science and faith. We don't sit around saying, oh dear, how do we bolster our faith under the onset of our science? No, we feel by and large that our science enhances our faith. And historically, this has not been the case. So if you think of many of the greatest scientists in history, people like Newton or Boyle or Faraday or Maxwell, and go on and on and on, modern people like Francis Collins, who helped decode the human genome, and others. These are people of deep, profound faith. And you might say that back in the past, it was a more Christian environment, it was natural to be a believer. But many of these scientists were much more religious than the people in their environment, and often kind of mocked for that. And so these are people for whom faith was extremely important in their science. So historically, this is a zombie myth, which I hope could be chopped down. The second zombie myth I want to chop at is this idea that conflict is the best description of the interaction between science and faith. So historians of science, who are the ones who study this, call this the conflict myth because it's persisted for so long, but no serious historian of science would say that conflict is the right way of looking at the history of science and faith. It's an interesting and complicated interaction, but conflict is not the right way to think about it. And part of the reason is many of these early scientists were people of deep, profound faith. The institutions of the church or monasteries played an important role in preserving and maintaining science. It's an interesting thing about the Big Bang. The first scientific treatise on the Big Bang was from a book on light by Robert Grosseteste in 1225. And it's an immensely powerful piece of intellectual work where he came up with the idea of a Big Bang. I like the that because we think that he was also a Chancellor of Oxford at some point, so that way we can get one for Oxford versus our great rivals, Cambridge. People sometimes think that the ages around, the Middle Ages, that there were dark ages, that people were somehow less smart than we are. We've somehow come out of this dark ages, now we're enlightened. But that's a mistaken way of looking at history. These are people of enormous intellectual capacity, people of also often of deep Christian faith and extremely thoughtful thinkers. Many of the modern kind of philosophical ways we think about science were birthed in those Middle Ages, in those dark ages. So that history is not the way that it's often told. Interestingly, if you poll secondary school students, about 70% of them will say that there is conflict between science and faith. That's the primary way they think about it. When pushed a bit further to explain why, they often can't. But it tells you this is a myth that's stayed in the air or in the water in ways that I don't understand. And perhaps the most interesting part of the myth is why it has persisted for so long, which is something we don't really understand. So conflict is the wrong way of thinking about this. In fact, I would go one further and say science has profound, deep Christian roots. So there's a whole series of things you need to do or believe in order to be successful at science. One of them is the idea of uniformity. So if I do an experiment here in Coventry under the same conditions in Oxford, then I should get the same results. And even somebody in Cambridge, if they're smart, should get the same results. And this is because we believe the laws of nature are the same under the same conditions at different places. And you may think that's unremarkable. But in Gabon, where I grew up in a small village, people's experience of nature, and I still had I met people that were somehow pre-modern in the sense they had lived mainly in the jungle most of their lives, not been in touch with the modern world. Their experience of nature was not of uniformity. Nature is fickle. Nature changes all the time. The idea that there should be uniform laws comes very clearly from a theological tradition of thinking about a God who sustains the world, thinking about the characteristics of that God, and out of that theological framework came what we now consider to be modern science. The next kind of zombie myth I want to get at is really one that believing in God is like believing in pink unicorns. That belief is something like blind faith. So blind faith, it would be something like the following. I have a 4-year-old daughter who delights in jumping off things and saying, "Daddy, catch me." And she does this all the time. She jumps off and I catch her. So far, I've mainly caught her, and she still believes. Although it was quite close yesterday. I was in church drinking coffee, speaking to a new visitor, and I turned to see her say, "Catch me." I did catch her, yes. But of course, I dropped the coffee all over the visitor, and that was the end of that. So she has not quite learned yet. But at some point, I will fail her. She'll catch me, and I won't catch her, and she'll cry, and then she'll learn that, that blind faith is not entirely trustworthy. So people sometimes think that believing in God is a little bit like that. You believe in something that is not really reliable or not really true. Or even further, you might think it's like believing in pink unicorns. Why do I say that? It's because Richard Dawkins, in his inimitable words, has said, if you want to believe in teapots, unicorns or tooth fairies, Thor or Yahweh, the onus is on you to say why you believe it. The onus is not on the rest of us to say why we do not. We who are atheists are also afairists, ateapotists, and aunicornists, but we don't have to bother saying so. Now, it's true that if I come to you and say, I've just discovered a new virus in my laboratory, and it has the following properties, then you're justified to say, well, I'm skeptical about this until you give me evidence for that virus. That's how science works. That skepticism is incredibly important in how we learn things about the natural world. And probably this would be true for teapots and unicorns and tooth fairies as well. But the God that Christians believe in is not part of this universe, some animal out there like ourselves, only bigger and smarter and stronger. God is the source of all being, the reason for why we exist. Without God, there would be no universe. And so this kind of idea that the argument is asymmetric, that without having some kind of evidence, like the evidence I would have for a pink unicorn, I should be a skeptic, an atheist for pink unicorns. That's also true for God, is, I think, a very important and very hard to kill zombie myth. Because it's a myth. That's not how the world works. The world is much more complicated than that. And I think a better way of thinking about it is John Polkinghorne, from Cambridge actually, who says, if we are to understand the nature of reality, we only have two possible starting points, either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. So what does he mean by these words, brute fact? What is he saying? Polkinghorne is saying, look, either God exists, and therefore the universe comes forth from God, or God doesn't exist. But fundamentally, what you can't do is find some kind of view from nowhere where you're unbiased and just look at them the way you might look at a pink unicorn or a virus that I claim I found in my laboratory. You have to step into that presupposition about there is a God, and then look at the world and ask yourself, does this make more sense of the world? Or say, let's assume there is no God, and look at the world and ask, does this make more sense or less sense? Now, one of the reasons why I think Christianity is incredibly intellectually satisfying is because, starting from the idea that there is a God, it makes sense of a whole series of things. It makes sense of the way the universe is made, the beauty and elegance of the universe. You'll be hearing more later about the fine-tuning of the universe. It actually makes sense of the fact that you can do science in the first place. It makes sense of what I consider to be a fact, that there are moral truths that are true whether we believe them or not, etc., etc. If you start from the idea there is no God, you may still believe those things, but it's a lot more work to try to figure out intellectually where they might come from. And finally, there's this question, will science answer our ultimate question? So I have a little mobile phone that I carry around, and it has more computing power than the computers that took the first mission to the moon. The speed with which science technology has advanced is absolutely amazing. The fact that I use it maybe to send pictures of my children to my wife and to my parents doesn't mean that the technology isn't absolutely powerful and can do a lot more. If I look at the health I and my family can expect compared to what we would have expected just a few generations ago, it's dramatically improved. And that is due to science. In fact, I think that science is the greatest thing that human beings have ever invented. I think science is absolutely amazing. And if there's one thing you take away from here about science, is that science is fantastic. Those of you who are taxpayers ought to support it more. I should thank you, by the way, for your tax money, because it pays for a lot of the science. Those of you who are students should think about careers in science, because science is really something amazing and powerful. It's really changed our world dramatically, and it will continue to do so in all kinds of amazing ways. But just because it's so powerful doesn't mean that it's going to one day answer all of our questions or all of our ultimate questions. And it would be great if that were true, but that's just not the way the world works. The world is much more subtle and complicated than that. And let me give you a few examples to try to illustrate this point, because this is, I think, a very important point for tonight and for the rest of our time together. Let's think about a question like, what is the value of a human being? Are human beings valuable or not? Well, we could try to measure as a scientist, so there are silly ways, like if I was a chemist, I'd measure the value of the elements in your body. But surely someone with gold fillings is not worth more than somebody without gold fillings. If I was a psychologist, I might measure how smart you are, or a sociologist, kind of how you interact in your community, or maybe an anthropologist, how your culture affects you. If I was an economist, I'd measure how much economic output you produce. And I sometimes worry that that's how we are measured by our government. But I think we all sense that every single one of those ways of measuring is impoverishing. In fact, it's not only that, it's actually dangerous to make the value of human beings measured by one of those different axes. Instead, our modern political and legal system is based very much on intrinsic dignity of human beings. Human beings have human rights that are inalienable, that don't depend on their race or their economic background or their gender or whether anything about them, any physical characteristic about them. They have intrinsic human rights. Now, the source of those human rights, Christians would say, comes from the fact that value comes from the fact that God created and loves each human being. But what science cannot do and will never do is give you an argument that will explain why human beings have intrinsic value. And the minute you try to use science to do that, you start degrading this incredibly important thing in our world. Let me give you another example. So I just celebrated my 10th, I'm about to celebrate my 11th wedding anniversary. Make sure I don't get that wrong. Is this being filmed? Okay, just cut that bit. My 11th wedding anniversary, thank you. And so when I just met my wife, Mary, the question is, should I have used rational, scientific ways of deciding whether she was the right one, or should I use irrational ways like faith? That may be a kind of naive way of thinking about this. Well, there are irrational ways of doing this. One of them would be you grab the first person you meet, or I met her for the first time and said, please marry me. And then if she said yes, that would be even more irrational, because we didn't know one another when we first met, even though I thought she looked pretty interesting when I first saw her. Instead, what we did is we got to know one another. We spent time with one another. We asked people that we knew and trusted what they thought of us together. We even did these compatibility tests, where you fill out all these questions, including like where do you squeeze a toothpaste and that kind of stuff. But you don't marry somebody because you both score 95% on the compatibility test. It's something more to it. And at the end of the day, when I asked Mary to marry me, and when she said, to my great relief, yes, and when we got married, the fact was that I was taking a step into the unknown, because I don't know what it's like to be married until I take a step of faith, as it were, and am married. Now, I can amass evidence about that. There are good and bad ways of getting that evidence, but at the end of the day, I don't know what it's like to be married until I am married. And I don't want to do repeatable experiments in it. That's not really how it works. So it's just part of the human condition, right? We make these kinds of decisions all the time. That doesn't mean they're irrational. It just means that there's a step of faith involved. And so that tells you that even if something is simple but incredibly important as choosing a life partner, the scientific method can maybe help a bit, but it's not the right way of adjudicating that particular question. Just like in legal cases, there are really well-defined and carefully honed ways of coming to truth, but they're not really scientific. They're a different way of obtaining truth. So there's lots of different ways of obtaining truth, but science is not the right way to do them for probably most of the really important decisions we have in life. And so that raises the specter of, well, how do we answer these ultimate questions then? Well, that wasn't my brief for tonight, but I won't stop right there. I'll just say, you've got two choices, basically. Either there is a God, and you can start from that and look around the world and ask yourself, does this make more sense of what I see? Or there is no God. And you can ask yourself, does that make more sense of what I see? But you've got to think about these things and work them through. And just like the knowledge that I have of my wife is partially knowledge I get from my senses, partially knowledge I have from experience, there's also a kind of sense of relational knowledge, things I just know through being with her for a long time. There may be knowledge of God that you acquire in that way. It would be strange if there was a supreme being who didn't have something like that that we could somehow encounter. And so my call to you is be a truth seeker. Look for truth where it is. Don't take these easy myths for a fact, but try to look behind them and try to decide whether there is a God or isn't a God. And if there is a God, what is that God like? Could that God be, in fact, a God who came to earth in human form and died for us so that we might live? Thank you very much.